Well, Jacki Johnson, our next speaker, joined IAG in 2001, then appointed CEO in 2010. Also Director of the Community First Credit Union, a member of the Community First Corporate Service Governance Committee, President, of course, of the Insurance Council, Chair of the Christchurch Recovery Chief Executives Forum. Jacki has more than 20 years industry experience, including roles with Allianz Insurance, HIH and IRS Total Injury Management. Some further perspectives around the demographic area, a really interesting area. Please welcome Jacki Johnson.
Bit of a hard act to follow, having so many good pieces of data. But I actually just wanted to really wrap it together and really talk about, well, what's our role as insurers, and just challenge a bit of our thinking. And I think what I was delighted for this conference, as the ICNZ were putting it together, is we are forward thinking. I mean, the last few years, we have had to really be responding to what was in front of us, and we haven't actually been able to really be addressing what next. And I think this is a really good moment for us here at this conference to do that and challenging ourselves. And I think we've got all those speakers today that helps do that. But really what we've heard today, and I'm going to be very simplistic, is where are people going to be living? What are they going to be doing? Why are they doing certain things behaviourally? And what does that mean for us? And we might think about it, about how people actually buy our products. But it's so much more than that, because in insurance, we're here about diversification. And our model doesn't actually work well if we don't get enough diversification across different types of people living in different places. Quite simply, I'm simplifying our industry a lot, I know. But that's how our model works. So this demographic shift is really important for us to think about how our insurance model works, not just how our consumers are buying. It also means about how people are being attracted to our industry. And I'm relieved to see Natalie's data saying we've got lots of young people coming through. But have we got the right skills? Have we got the diversity of gender? Have we got the diversity of ethnicity coming through that will stay relevant to our customers? And I want to touch on some of those things. But also Natalie talked a bit about Christchurch. And one of the reasons I asked the question is because when I think about our catastrophe response, which remember for us to be relevant to consumers, it's about being there when it really matters. And we're really seeing that in the years that we've put in as an industry in Christchurch. And several people I'm looking at in the room sat in a meeting in 2011 with government when all the research on catastrophes show that when a catastrophe hits, the biggest economic issue and social issue is depopulation. And there are a lot of examples around the world where some economies never ever recover and some communities never ever recover. And so we stepped back and worked with government and said, what would it take as an industry for us to keep avoiding depopulation? And those census numbers that show that the Canterbury region didn't have the scale of depopulation that we saw after Hurricane Katrina in the US and other parts of the world, I don't think we step back enough as an industry and think about why we're doing certain things in Christchurch and partnering with CIRA, partnering with all the other stakeholders, because that was a strategic intent right back in 2011. We'd looked at the demographics. So how do we make sure we call ourselves to account about that every time we look at our purpose in a community? And I think we really have to continue to challenge ourselves on that. The other thing is I look around this room and we are getting a little bit more diverse than we used to as an industry, and I have been in the industry for 25 years in Australia and New Zealand. I want you to put your hand up if you were born in a European country or have worked in a European country. So a majority of this audience. Put your hand up if you have worked or were born in one of the Asian countries. So we've got quite a few. Put your hand up if you were born and have only ever worked in New Zealand. So we've got a bit of a range, but what that show of hands showed is we still have a tendency to be very Anglo-Saxon. Now what about, put your hand up if you are Maori or Pacifica. That doesn't represent our population. It does not represent our customer base either. So I know we often get talked about the demographics, about where people are living, but it's also who are we employing, and I will challenge us on that as we go through the next little while. So let's get started. I want to talk about the context, and I won't spend too much time on that because I think Shamabul and Natalie did a very good job on helping paint the picture. But I want to talk about the impacts and our response. So let's look at this changing New Zealand. The ageing piece, I found Natalie's presentation quite stark. It means we're all going to have to work for a very long time, was what I summarised out of that. And in terms of this issue about a growing population in some regions, how are we understanding that challenge about diversification? And then when we start to look at this smaller families, all I could think of is the two-person household with no children, and it must be a very quiet household that I think some people, some evenings would like to have. But this point about individuals living alone, what about how does that lend people to think about what they're doing with their assets in terms of the share economy? So I have a car that might not be used every day. Do I then let other people drive it? Airbnb, one of the fastest growing accommodation businesses in the world. If you're living in one of those four-person houses and you're alone, do you then let the other three houses out? How do our insurance policies respond? Most of them, if it's not a landlord's policy, we would be declining claims on those people, often. So how are we thinking about that? That's not future, that's here now. How are we thinking about that smaller family and what's the potential on the assets that we're insuring, particularly when we start to look at those personal lines? And then you can see some of the other pieces that were highlighted really, really well in the earlier presentations. But there are wider sets of influences that we have to constantly be thinking about as we look at all the pieces of how we behave on the population. And I won't spend too much time on that because I think a really good job was done in the previous speakers. But we do have to take a longer term view, and we have to think of a broader stakeholder group than just our customers, the communities, or the people we will be employing. We need to think about how does that help us when we're discussing things with our prudential regulator, for example, about risk appetites, that when we're talking about what we'll insure, how we'll insure it, how do we make sure prudential regulation continues to move at the rate we need it to move to be able to stay relevant and affordable and accessible? That's a real challenge for us as an industry. How do we make sure that we're partnering, and I think we've got examples with, particularly in Christchurch where we've done that, but also in some other parts of New Zealand, partnering with government on responses, but more than response, on risk mitigation. And I know we're going to spend a bit of time this afternoon on that very topic. So all the set of stakeholders are really important, and I do acknowledge the reinsurers in the room, that I think all of us are very, very grateful for the support we've been having from reinsurance in the last few years, because it just shows how important the global capacity is important to New Zealand when we have a propensity to be one of the highest exposed for natural perils in the world here. And when we think about that essential role, there's a lot of debate about, well, what do we do? Is it all just a price signal? But it's more than that. We actually do help promote trade. And we think about what the fears were in 2011 when we had that perfect storm, as Shamabul pointed out, about a global recession starting to hit, and we have the biggest natural disaster and one of the most complex in the world. That if we did not have an insurance industry that was supporting those small businesses that had business interruption, how would we have kept people employed down in Christchurch in those small businesses? And it was very important for us to give confidence globally that New Zealand was open to business. And so that trade piece is particularly important. How we manage the risk signals is really, really important, and part of our signature to the UN principles of sustainable insurance. We really do need to make sure that we're understanding we're one part of the equation, which is the transfer of risk contractually, as Tim pointed out in his opening, but we also have to be investing in helping communities and individuals understand risk management, and they own the asset that is really important in terms of them wanting to do something with that and having choice. And so overall, the context for us is we've got all those things that drive how relevant we are, but we've got all these societal changes happening around us and global changes. We have to map the two together. So let's look at our view on what the impacts are. Number one, availability of insurance. The most scary part in my whole career in 2011 was the thought that we might not get reinsurance in this country. I'd only arrived in September 2010, perfect time to arrive in the country. But one of the big issues was, what would we have done in terms of no capacity? And there were a lot of challenges around Wellington, particularly for some commercial properties. Boy, has that changed now in the industry, isn't it, as we're in a very competitive market, because the global capacity has changed. So we have to think about how we fit within that global economic and the global population shifts that help us keep insurance available here. The reality is we are one of the highest insured countries in the world against our GDP. And I said on this podium last year, we have a legacy to protect, and we must make sure we lead in a way that keeps insurance available. But we also, the other impact is about consumer participation. And some interesting statistics say that if you are European of descent, you are more likely, 88% of New Zealanders are more likely to have insurance overall. And that's a global phenomenon because it goes back to where does insurance come from, back to our history in Lloyd's. People get used to actually using insurance as a mechanism. Anyone hazard a guess if you're Asian of descent, what you're likely to have, what the penetration rate's likely to be? No, it's a bit rosier than that, John. It's actually 55%. However, that's people who have been living here. We're seeing a big wave of migration, as Natalie showed, and I know at IAG, we have our emerging Asian operations, and we're not seeing people having a natural propensity to buy insurance. We're having to stimulate their purchasing. So of the new migrants, how relevant are we being to understand that consumer participation? Okay, the third group, what about Pacifica? Now that's quite a big group, I know, of different groups, but what do you think the penetration rate is of Pacifica buying insurance? Yeah, it's 25%. So if you think about that and how we need to think about how are we helping consumers participate with our industry and in our product, it's what Natalie was saying. If you just look at average statistics, so we very proudly say we are the most highly penetrated insurance market in the world against property insurance. But if you break it down by ethnicity, it doesn't show that in certain pockets of our population. And then what's scary, you listen to Shamambul and you look at Natalie's statistics, it says of those growing groups, they're not going to find us as relevant. And therefore, participation might be lower. And we're a very small market. So how are we going to have very competitive market, small market, and be relevant to the rest of the world so we attract our wonderful reinsurers if we're not maintaining consumer participation? So I want us to think about that as an impact. And then when we look at affordability, as I said, we actually, whether we like it or not, we try to price for risk. But if we truly, and this is the debate in Australia at the moment, if we truly priced for the risk, there would be components of our community that would not be able to afford the insurance. And we know that. And particularly as you get more people hugging the coast, and I think Natalie's maps actually showed where population growth was happening and where it wasn't. And so the challenge for us is on this affordability debate, how do we send a risk signal but still make it affordable for that growing number of people Natalie talked about who are on fixed income and who are going to have to pay more for their health care because health costs are going up, life insurance, and all those other components. How are we going to balance that household spend? And how are we going to help people understand the choices they're making? And how are we going to balance the way we structure our products so people might need to actually take more risk themselves, but know if the worst happens, if they've selected a $10,000 excess, they have to have that money ready to pay it if the worst happened. And then we have a reputational risk of how we manage that. But all of those are ways we try to address the affordability issue so people stay insured. Because ultimately we need to send the risk signal, but we also have to price for the risk generally. Interesting dilemma with the data that Natalie showed, because I constantly get asked by customers in Auckland about why their premiums might have changed in 2012, because it's about those Christchurch people or those Wellington people. Thinking that there are no hazards here in Auckland, and I'm sure we're going to hear a few things later this afternoon about the hazards we face here in Auckland. So we have to try and help educate people about true risk without panicking a whole community, but in a way that helps explain that affordability is also not just about the household income. It's about, can you afford to face something that is likely to happen and you don't have cover? What does that mean? I think at the moment a lot of people are working very hard to stay in the house insurance market, but what we're seeing is less participation rate in the second car being insured, for example. On the philosophy of it's only worth $800, so I won't insure it, not thinking about what I might hit that might be worth a lot more than that $800. And so some of the work ICNZ and the board have supported ICNZ, the ICNZ board, is about this risk literacy. So banks focusing on financial literacy, us really participating in the community on risk literacy, because it goes to the heart of affordability is actually within a household pool. What can you afford in a household if something goes wrong? And then if we look at the asset quality, and Shamabul really highlighted some of the dilemmas here. And I loved the smart shrinkage concept that was alluded to. If you've got some areas shrinking in New Zealand, some communities, and the houses being left or only rented out, and then they're not being maintained, what does that mean for how we insure that property and how we underwrite it? There may come a time that not only does that community have a decreasing community pool of people paying rates, you may also, and not in jobs, you may end up with a challenge where we might not be able to insure some of the properties because they're poorly maintained. Or we insure them and then we have ongoing debates at claim time because it was a maintenance issue with the house, not an issue of damage through a natural disaster or anything that was covered by the policy. So we constantly have to reflect when our sales force are selling products, how we're helping make this clear for different regions where we might think there's more risk of asset quality. One thing that really surprised me in 2010 when I arrived was how many cars I saw on the road that I hadn't seen for a very long time. And because I'm a bit of a car nut, I really liked being able to identify all these different cars, but the reality is we have quite an ageing fleet of cars. Now, I think the last year with our economic growth in some sectors of New Zealand has helped because our imports are quite high for some vehicles, but we do have a lot of older cars here. So at what point do we have a challenge of being able to keep them insured? And we know that car insurance is more of a complex issue than just repairing our customer's car. It's about other things that can be damaged around it, but also how it interacts with the ACC. So I think this whole issue of asset quality is going to be important. Businesses, both previous speakers did highlight the challenge with business and how they keep insured and how we make sure that businesses are not in decline, don't somehow end up not understanding what their insurance covers them and what they don't. The relevance I've touched on, we really do need to stay relevant to our customers, both in what they want to insure in terms of their asset, how they want to buy it. And I think it was a great pickup that Chairman Bull made about over 65s with iPads. Some of my teams in the direct insurance space were telling me that there were certain pockets of New Zealand who never wanted to use the apps. One of our fastest download of our app for state and AMI have been a demographic that our own staff did not think about. And in fact, there are over 65s who love to engage online and they love to engage. So how do we make sure that we're thinking about the relevance, not just by bands of age or where people live, but really understanding the customer behaviour as an individual? And that's a real challenge for us with relevance. And then when we start to think about accessibility, and the ageing one is a really important one because if you think about how we tend to interact by phone or online or even in our branches or stores, and with the brokers also connections, we have to think about people who might have decreasing vision, decreased hearing, decreasing mobility. How are we gearing up as underwriters and how are brokers gearing up to engage with people who might have accessibility issues? And it might be easy to say, well, they can come online. What's the font of most sites? What if you've got decreased vision? How are we making our sites more accessible and how are we testing for that as well? So I would challenge us all to be thinking about that impact. Talent and diversity. I think I said last year the unfortunate challenge of being a female CEO, the minute you use the word diversity, people think it's because you're the girl, you're going to talk about females in the industry. We have a bigger challenge for us, as we showed in the introduction, that we really need to think about, are we representing our customer base and really having enough diverse expertise coming in to understand the world going in the future? Because we tend to have a limited pool of people. The school leaver number that Natalie showed I thought was a bit frightening when we start to think, do we understand our workforce planning enough? And this issue about the possible impacts of all those things, we need to confront our unconscious bias. But not only ourselves, our customers and other stakeholders. So I'm going to tell two very quick stories, seeing the time eking away on the clock. One was from an elderly customer on the South Island, wanted to see me as CEO, had a very, very serious issue with IAG. So I go and see this particular customer, and what he wanted to talk to me about was the person he had to speak on a very specific underwriting issue in Auckland, and they were Indian. And this is going to be a horrifying statement to say, but what his exact quote to me was, "It is bad enough the government let them in, you should not employ them." Now, we might think that's funny, but the graph that Natalie showed about the mix of over 65s and their ethnic origins versus the new wave of people who are our customers and our people working for us, how are we going to get that match? Because that's an unconscious bias. It wasn't even that unconscious, he very much had a conscious bias. And a bit closer to home for us, we had a formal email from a small broker complaining that because we put 3 female managers into claims positions, they knew things were going to deteriorate the minute IAG got a female CEO. That's pretty horrifying in this day and age. This only happened at the beginning of this year. So you can imagine there was a very interesting response and engagement model. But it just says that we can face our biases, but we have to actually help influence around us the biases that will impact on how we stay relevant, affordable, accessible for our people and our customers. And for New Zealand, to make sure that we keep an insurance industry. We need to work through others. We're very proud to be a UN signature of sustainable insurance because we think that that really helps broaden our impact and get expertise globally as well. But we need to start now as an industry of addressing the issues that we have control of and influencing those around us so we stay relevant, affordable and accessible for many years to come. And that's our leadership job right now as an industry here in New Zealand. So thank you.
Jacki, thanks very much. 2 panels. We were on a panel just a couple of weeks ago at the Insurance Brokers Conference as well too. Tell us, from an industry perspective, what's occupying your mind the most at the moment. You touched on a number of things, but what's the biggest trend that as an industry the sector needs to be thinking about?
Yeah, and I think we're going to touch on quite a few of them today, but obviously the recovery of Christchurch, I think, given that we do have this meeting that many of the CEOs in this room sit on it was every fortnight, we've just moved them to monthly, it stays top of mind for us all the time. But it's also about how do we make sure that we're understanding the technology, and that came up at the IBANS conference, and I've watched the blogs after Ross Chapman and I gave the answer of people asking why Ross and I were forcing people to go online, and actually the question came from the audience of the brokers. But I think technology and how we manage the technology shifts that we need to without really, I think this channel grazing is an interesting debate because I think we have to stay relevant for all our customers. We've got a small population, and how do we continue to invest? Shamabil made a very good point, but you invest at a key point of time in technology, and that's when your industry or your company can grow. So that keeps me, and just making sure that we're profitable in the times where we haven't got the big shocks of natural perils, because we all know it's a cycle, and you get a fair bit of reputational heat when you've had to make a reasonable return, knowing that in 2011 we all wiped off our balance sheet.
Questions for Jacki?
Jacki, regarding the demographics and the changing cultures, one of the challenges you had up there was people who speak English as a second language, and whether or not we... Has it gone off? No. And whether or not we translate policy wordings.
Yeah.
I remember some feedback we got in the early 2000s when we had a lot of Chinese people coming into Auckland, and we were looking at, did we need to translate wordings? And the answer came back, no, we're quite happy to speak in English. We know we're in New Zealand, we'll read English. We care a lot more about how you treat us, and that we're treated equitably when you sell us the product, that you will sell us the same product that you sell a white person or a Kiwi New Zealander.
Yeah.
Care to comment?
Yeah, I do, and I mean, I think if we take the Need to Know campaign, Claire, when we were looking at what we had to do in terms of making sure that we were advertising in some of the different press that might have been Indian, Chinese, Korean, and that we needed to communicate. And a big question is our policy wordings. I mean, I think a biggest challenge for us as an industry is no one reads their policy wordings anyway. So we have a bigger issue about they're not that relevant to our general customer population. How do we make sure that they're easier to read for everyone? But then the question is, how do we actually make sure that we're translating? But you've got even a first order problem that often we're not even selling our product or communicating, and I think we've done a lot of work on that, and I'm very proud of some of the way I think our workforce shaping and getting that diversity of people around a table. People are calling it out because we've got people saying, well, I know, being Chinese, and you look at our graduate program, the highest proportion are coming from more the Asian graduates, and they're calling us out. I get challenged in the lift on a weekly basis on that very point. So it's great. They don't know political correctness, and I love it because they speak up all the time. So it's a very good point.
Okay, other questions? A couple of minutes left. So, Jacki, let's just touch a bit about on the value proposition, because you touched on that in your presentation, an increasing segment of the market that perhaps doesn't see the value of insurance. Is that also going to create a challenge for you? What is creating a challenge for you, and how will you address that?
And I think it's up to all of us to think about why is that and really helping communicate. So I know some of the learnings we're getting out of our China market is because people have been used to having big extended families living in a household. Well, when they migrate to New Zealand, they don't often have that big extended family, and taking on Natalie's data, I'd suggest by 2026 they're not going to be in that position either. But their form of insurance, if you like, as an alternative product was someone will always be home. And so we're going to have to face those things, and it's about communication and understanding.
And just finally, on the diversity issue, that survey you ran at the start, particularly Māori and Pacifica in the industry, that's a challenge for the industry? How will you?
Absolutely, and I'm going to call out something that I think is sacrosanct, and all the underwriters in the room are going to be horrified. But I have a real challenge for us as an industry when we want to actually participate with the iwi as they get more of their economic value into industries, and yet things like maraes we find difficult to insure. Now, how different is that to really expensive artwork? And, how are we actually really thinking? I know some of our underwriters are going to cringe in the room, but how can we say we're going to be trusted by that part of the population if something that's most precious to them is something we've just got this unconscious bias about, well, they'll all burn down and we can't replace carvings. So I challenge us on that. How do we stay relevant to what's important?
It's a good point. $42 billion, the value of the Māori economy, and growing rapidly at this stage.
Yeah.
So if you don't think it's a challenge at the moment, it's certainly going to be in the years to come. All right, Jacki, thank you very much.